Hi friends, welcome to Raising Lifelong Learners. I'm your host, Colleen Kessler, and this is the podcast where I encourage you to trust yourself and your differently wired kiddos as you help cultivate their curiosity, encourage them to discover the world around them, embrace who they are wired to be, all while helping them discover their passions, interests, and raise them to become the amazing adults they're meant to be. Hey, welcome back. This is episode 246. I have to tell you, I am so excited about this episode because I have been recommending the book by this author, Emotional Intensity in Gifted Students, for years and years and years. In fact, I have given away my own copy so many times that I have rebought Christine Fonseca's book so many times, and she's on the podcast today. She and I have connected online and via different forums and online summits throughout the years, but we have never actually talked one-on-one. It was such a gift for me. Christine is inspiring. She is smart, down to earth. She understands the gifted brain. She understands emotional intensity. And it was just great. I actually can't wait to get her back on to talk about a million other topics with regards to giftedness and the social and emotional impact that giftedness has on kids and adults. So you are going to want to really listen to this episode because I know you're going to have so many great takeaways. Before we get started, though, I just want to give a quick special shout out to CTC Math. CTC Math is such a generous sponsor. They keep this podcast going and they keep my life going because I'm a customer as well. I pay for my subscription to CTC Math for my two kids who are currently using it to use, and they support the podcast. Check them out, ctcmath.com. I'll talk a little bit more about them later on in this episode. In the meantime, I want you to pop your earbuds in. I want you to really listen. If that means you need to multitask, because some of our brains need multitasking to really focus, do it. If that means you need a quiet room with some chocolate, do that. But you are going to love this episode. Please make sure you tell me any of your takeaways and you go to the show notes for this episode and leave me a voicemail message or send me an email and tell me what your biggest takeaway was from it, because Christine is such a wealth of knowledge. You are going to love her. And I'm so excited to bring you this episode. So let's get on with it. Here we go. All right. I am so excited about today's podcast episode because I have been talking about my guest's books for years, and I've been hoping to get her on, and our schedules have finally connected. So welcome, Christine Fonseca.
I'm so excited to be here.
This is fun because it's like our paths have crossed in internet circles for years and blog hops and speaking events and things like that. And I was first introduced to your work like decades ago. I was working as a gifted specialist in the schools and then raising my own profoundly gifted kiddo. And I came across emotional intensity in gifted children or gifted students and have read it. And actually, this is my from my classroom.
Love it.
That actually it's not. So it's my third or fourth copy, but it was in my classroom because it's the one. This is the book that I recommend and loan out to so many people and then don't get back, but I'm okay with it because I know they need it. So for those of you listening, I'm gonna let Christine introduce herself in a second, but this is the book that you need if you are raising gifted kids, because whether you homeschool them like we do here or not, it is the best book out there on emotional intensity in gifted children. And if your kids are in school, you'll get so many things that you can pass on to teachers. But if you're home with your kids and you can't get past the word student and teacher and classroom, forget about it. You have to, because it's the most conversationally written, down to earth, practical, applicable version of anything out there about emotional intensity in gifted kids, and will give you the tools you need to nurture your children the way they need to be nurtured. So thank you for writing this book. And I know
what an honor. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, it's transformational. And I know so many people that I've referred it to over the years have been transformed by it as well. So it's in its third edition. We'll link to it in the show notes. But if you've not read this book, you have to. But before we even get into emotional intensity and all of those things, Christine, why don't you take a second, introduce yourself to those guests who might not be familiar with you?
Awesome. Well, my name's Christine Fonseca. I'm a developmental psychologist and school psychologist by training and have been for about 30 years. I am a gifted adult. I've raised two now adult children, gifted children, and I'm married to a gifted husband. And so at any given time, our household is just intense. And I have all sorts of stories of good sides of that intensity and not so good sides of intensity as well. And they're in my books. When I'm not doing work or writing, I also write fiction. It is actually probably near and dear to my heart, big love of mine. And I'm what's called a fiber artist, which just means I like to tie knots for fun because it's relaxing. I have a lifestyle Etsy shop that my kids convinced me to start with them during the pandemic. Some people were baking bread. We started an Etsy shop for all of our nerdy fandoms. I don't know why, but there you go. That's me.
I love that. And it speaks to just that whole multi potential aspect of giftedness. And I know so many people can resonate with that as they're listening because if apples don't fall far from trees. And so if you've
100%.
got a gifted child, you've got multiple gifted children, and one or both of you are in that realm as well. I know that breeds all sorts of interesting stories, like you said, in
It
the
does.
family, which,
It does. Life
oh
experiences.
my
Yeah.
gosh. Yeah. And I think that that's what makes your work so rich and easy to digest and apply to everyday life because it is rife with stories and so important for people who are raising neurodivergent children who are on the gifted spectrum because there's no such thing as just gifted. There's just not.
Yeah. What
Um,
is that? Like,
right. I was
just gifted.
I was at I think it was a SING conference one year, and my mentor from college, I'm a gifted specialist by trade, and my mentor is Jim Delisle. He's who I worked under
Love
in,
Jim. Oh, I love Jim so much.
he's one of the greatest guys on earth. I was so lucky that he was my advisor at Kent State
For
University.
sure.
And so he and I were there, we were talking, and we hadn't seen each other in years. And we were talking about twice exceptionalities and this,
Mhm.
that, and the other. And he's like, it's so hard because it's like a chicken and egg situation. What came first? And
100%.
is it really true that there are just gifted, or are they just all twice exceptional? Because there's so many intensities that go
Yeah.
along with high intelligence and high cognitive ability and creativity that it's next to impossible to separate that out. So if you've got gifted kids, you've got intense kids. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
You do, absolutely. That's an interesting premise to kind of ponder. Like, do you really have just purely gifted? I would actually argue you do, because I think we pathologize intensity in
Yes.
our culture. And so I think, there's been this pathology around having really intense emotions or feeling really deeply and kind of wearing that on your sleeve in a way that I actually think it just isn't healthy. And so I think some of those neurodivergent twice exceptionalities maybe aren't. Maybe it's just you're just looking at giftedness and what giftedness for that particular individual means. I don't ever want to take away from someone if they feel they are truly, A, B, or C in
Right.
addition to giftedness. But I think because we have better understandings of because of a disease model and a medical model, we have better understanding of things like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, anxiety disorders than we do giftedness. Giftedness is still, about a paragraph and a half in a typical mental health textbook. And so we just don't have good knowledge, and we're not raising people in the field, in the profession, with good knowledge of really understanding that no, human beings who are gifted, just their experience of the world is different. And so that's kind of how the phrasing I've been using now with people is just their experience of their emotional world is different. Their experience of what it is to interact with others is different.
Yes. Okay. So I love that because it actually goes along with what Jim and I were
Mhm.
talking about. And I think that we actually agree. And his point and the point of our conversation with that ended up being like, you can't separate those things. So
Right.
that's just who they are. And our
Exactly.
world defines things based on the pathologies. And
Right.
so we use those terms to describe. So an example, we were talking about stories before. My oldest, who's now 21 and is like the poster child for overexcitabilities and intensities. Like
Mhm.
he could have been Dabrowski's lab rat, for every one of them. And when he went to like a church camp when he was in like 6th or 7th grade or something. And all of his challenges were rooted in his cognitive ability. Like I knew where he fell on the
Yeah.
IQ scale. I knew where he was in the profound gifted range and how that manifested in real life and why he didn't necessarily fit in groups super well.
Hmm.
To explain that is next to impossible,
Right.
especially to get the accommodations that we knew he needed, like, a little bit not okay. So, what we ended up doing was just diagnosing him on the paper as ADHD.
Right. So that
And
you could get what you needed.
exactly. So if he needed a break, he could go for a walk, or if he wasn't focused, the whatever he had we were using some supplements at the time because they really helped enrich he was using some, I don't know, fatty acids and stuff like that because they did help him at that time. And
Yeah.
so in order to get those, he had to have a diagnosis. And so, yes, we're in this world of diagnoses. So while one of my daughters is diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder and exhibits like
Hmm.
textbook and was diagnosed by a licensed psychologist and whatever. My other one, who's very, very, very bright and creative and articulate, also sees the world in a very emotional way. And so she's intense in a way that looks like anxiety, but I know that kid does not have
Yeah.
generalized anxiety disorder
Yeah.
like her sister because it's just not the same and it's situational and it's emotional and so I still say she's got anxiety when I'm talking to somebody because they're going to give her more
Oh,
leeway and
totally.
accommodation. So it's so hard, right, to bridge that gap and
Yeah.
like give your gifted kids what they need without giving them another diagnosis. So
Well,
help them,
we could go on a whole nother
right?
podcast about why labels drive services and if that's actually a good model. Like just in
Yes, we
general.
could.
That's a whole nother topic. I'm all for let's meet the human where they're at, give them what they need to be successful, and then see what happens. I don't
Yeah.
know. Seems pretty basic to me, but what do I know?
No, and I think that I think that that's where in my experience homeschooling has been the biggest benefit for my
Sure,
particular kids is
sure.
because of exactly that. And truthfully, back when before some things in education changed to where they
Yeah.
are currently, when I was a gifted specialist in the school system, it was an easier thing for me to meet my
Right.
gifted kids
You
where they
knew which
were.
those levers were
Yes.
easier to pull to get
It's
your kids what they needed.
totally
Yeah.
without, a paper trail of testing and things like that. You
Right.
could just meet them and move them forward, which is what homeschooling ultimately allowed us to do. But yeah, let's go back to the intensities because I think
Sure.
that those drive a lot of those diagnoses and pathologies.
100%.
And so, like, what does that look like in a gifted kid? And how, as parents, especially the majority, I would say probably about 80% of the people listening to this podcast are homeschooling their gifted kids.
Hmm.
So how does that drive what we do daily as parents and meeting them where they are and then understanding what's intensity because they're gifted and what's like behavioral and what's like where do we separate those
Yeah,
things?
so teasing all that out is difficult. And so, really, probably the best description I've heard of intensity, kind of in real practical terms, is gifted human beings interact with the world or paint the world in bold colors while everybody else is painting in pastels. And that's really what it's like. I would love to take credit for that quote, but I can't. A good friend of mine who's a parent of double gifted kids, came up with that. And I told her I was going to swipe it from her and she said sure. But
That's
I've always
great.
described it that way because it's so visceral and I think we all have a picture in our head of what that is.
Mm-hmm.
Gifted human beings, they don't do anything halfway. They're 100% in or not in at all. And that could mean if they're happy, they're 100% happy. If they're sad, they're 100% sad. They're usually vacillating between the two so fast, you're really questioning your own sanity or theirs. All of these things are kind of true. You know, some of our gifted kids who process the world orally talk nonstop. That's particularly true with our gifted extroverted children, not to be confused with our gifted introverted person who hears all that verbal stuff and is like, oh my gosh, you've overwhelmed me so much. I just can't, my nervous system is on fire now and I just can't even function. So I have one of each in my household. They used to share a room. That was bad news. I separated that real fast. That was worth me giving up an office. Absolutely. But there's lots of ways these intensities may show up. And as a parent, it can feel really overwhelming. It can feel like something is really wrong with my kid. These behavioral strategies I know have worked in other venues in my life are just not working with my kids. They're challenging everything I'm doing. You know, is it the generation today that's the problem? Is it like, what is it? And I would say, no, it's just what it is to be gifted. And so, you know, I'm a firm believer in gifted. Understanding that your kid is gifted is really important, but being gifted is not an excuse for bad behavior.
I love that. Okay, I love that. I want say that again, please.
So being gifted is important that we as parents understand that, but being gifted in and of itself is not an excuse for bad behavior.
Yeah.
As I always say, I worked with gifted kids in my own academic setting at schools and then with my own children as well. The bill collector won't care that you can cure cancer. They care that you can't figure out how to put a stamp on an envelope and get it in the mail.
Yep.
Or that you can't figure out what button you're supposed to push by what date to pay that bill on time. That's really the only thing they care about. They do not care that it's not convenient for you, and nobody else will either. And so your needs, rights, whatever's as a human being do not actually get to infringe on the needs, rights, et cetera, of the collective whole or of other individuals. And so even raising my own children, one of the things we always used to talk about is your needs and rights don't get to infringe on anyone else's, and their needs and rights don't get to infringe on yours. Part of being human is figuring out how to make all that work.
Yes. That's so important for all aspects, right? Whatever kind of neurodivergent child you're raising, that is really the core and crux of what it means to be human and living
and to live
in
community, which we do. So unless we're going to be nomads and be our own, you know, community of four, which fine, if that's your thing, that's your thing. But unless that's you, and there's very few places on the planet where we can successfully go be nomads, then you got to figure out how to deal with other humans. You just have to figure that out. And so for me, in raising my two gifted children, I have the benefit of working in and living in a really, really good school district. So we just let the public school do their thing with our children, and then we enriched. And part of enrichment had to do with enriching in areas, in their passion areas, right? But part of enriching also meant teaching the EQ part of all of this. And part of enriching meant, how do I, as a unicorn, live amongst the zebras successfully? Because that's also that's what they're going to have to figure that out. And it's been really interesting. My oldest daughter is now 27 and has a great job and really enjoys it. But it's been interesting, our conversation. She and I talk pretty much every day, Monday through Friday at a specified time. When I get off work, I usually call her when I'm on the way home from work. It's very nice. I love it. But she and I recently have been talking about her realization, how smart she is compared to some of her peers, and she works with incredibly talented humans. She's an artist and she works professionally as an artist with a whole bunch of other very talented artists, but who aren't necessarily gifted. They're good at what they do, but they're not necessarily gifted. And I think this has really been the first time in her adulthood when she's really understood what I meant when I would tell her, you need to understand the way you interact with the world is just different. It's not good or bad. It's just different. And at times in your life, that difference is going to matter. So the more you understand about that difference, the easier it's going to be for you.
Yeah. It's so hard, right? Especially when you're in your microcosm of gifted individuals living in the same household and learning to work within each other's intensities, how to figure out how to translate that to outside.
Exactly. With somebody whose brain just works slower.
Right.
You can't see the gestalt the way you do.
Yes.
As quickly as you do.
Yes. And in the same.
How infuriating it is, because it's like, why can't you just do A, B, and C? Like that, how does that not make sense?
Right. Hey there. Okay, so you've heard me talk about CTC math for months and months, and it is because we just love it here. It has made my homeschooling easier, especially when it comes to math. I'm not a mathy person, and I never have been, but I love CTC because it makes it easy for me. And then when my kids struggle with a certain concept or they're not getting something quickly enough, I can watch the lesson too, and then I can get it. So it's teaching me really, truly, almost as much as it's teaching the kids, because if I don't get something, I can watch the tutorials. And that exact experience happened to a longtime follower, Sandy, who wrote in, "We started using CTC math following your recommendation, Colleen. One of my sons is so dedicated. Then, after watching over his shoulder, my other son started using it too. They both do an hour each weekday, their choice." Now, side note here, CTC math only takes about 7 to 10 minutes per lesson. My kids tend to do 1 to 2, sometimes very occasionally 3 lessons a day. So we're talking like anywhere between 15 and 40 minutes of math a day, max. But Sandy's kids are so into it that they are doing an hour a day, their choice. Okay, so Sandy says, "I even enjoy it myself. I do the lessons with them, which is a handy brush up, and will occasionally do some of the algebra lessons ahead of time. Math was not my strong suit in school, but now I love it, and I wish the program had been available in the 80s. Too many people think they're terrible at math, but I truly believe we all need a method of learning that suits us. CTC math seems to work for all 3 of us." I asked my 13-year-old son, who's been using the program for about 18 months, what he thinks of it, and in his own words, he said he enjoys reaching mastery in a particular subject because I know that if I get a question wrong, he says, I'll have to redo all the questions until I reach mastery. That means I will have a full grasp of the subject, and that's pretty satisfying. 13-year-old, come on, like you can't beat that. Okay, FYI, Sandy says, I have the pass rate set to 90%. So parents, you can set the rate you want your kids to meet. My settings, depending on the kid, are set between 85 and 95%. I've got one kid who is a full year ahead in math, and he's really good at math, and his is set to 95%. I've got another one who's a little iffy at math, and that kiddo's level is set to 85%. So you get to do what you want to do in it, and that's amazing. Okay. She goes on to say, and finishes off this quote by saying, CTC math is unlike any platform that's out there, and I just love it. I appreciate you, Colleen. You have a special place in my heart for everything you put into your work, and I appreciate you and all the things you share. Seriously, I'm going to keep sharing resources like CTC Math because they work. They make homeschooling easier, and they allow us to do the things that we want to do with our kids, and basically take off of our plates the things we have to do with our kids. Our kids need math. Let CTC do it. Check them out at ctcmath.com. Let them know I sent you. And then if you've got a story to share, I'd love to hear it. All right, let's get back to today's episode. My daughter and I were having this conversation. She's 16, going on 30. She's always been like that. She came out, I don't know. I think she came out with a book in hand. I don't remember her not reading. Yeah. She's just one of those precocious kids. And I was talking yesterday, we were taking one of her friends home, and the 3 of us were talking in the car, and he is also a very gifted individual. And I was using a word, I don't know, like precocious or something. And she said, you're the only one besides him that I know that talks like that. And both of you guys say that I'm profound, and I say profound things all the time. And I don't get it. I just talk. And I'm like, I don't get it either. I just talk. But that's again, the difference in your brain and how it works. You think about using terms like it would behoove you to do XYZ when others don't. And that's not an abnormal word. It's just not commonly used in the sphere you're in. And so
Right.
I don't want you dumbing down your language, but I also
Ever.
want you to know that you see things, you talk about things, you describe things in a different way. Again, like you said, not better, not worse, just it is what it is. So be who you are and know that others might not get it, or they might need, a little bit more time to catch up to where you are. And that's okay. But you need to know about the processing, and right, surrounding yourself with people who get you is an
Yeah.
important skill to have as well.
So you're reminding me of a story. I was in a work situation, newer company I was working with, and we used to have these weekly meetings, and I would get really, really frustrated because I would call my CEO and my COO's attention to some behavior that was going to lead to not so good outcomes. And I could see it really easily, and I would bring it up, and I would experience a lot of frustration that they weren't, as the leaders of their organization, being more proactive in preventing some things from happening that were going on internally that were really toxic. And I remember expressing that frustration, and my boss looked at me and he goes, "You have to understand, you see it a lot sooner than we ever see it." Now, these are people who are very intelligent humans, very
Right.
intelligent, absolutely likely on the gifted spectrum. Like, it's not that they weren't, but the way in which my giftedness presented itself and the way my brain works, just from my own, where my strengths are and whatnot, enabled me to see things like a chess player, like about 20 moves early. And I would express something, assuming that they saw it too, because of course they have that same label, right? They're gifted. So of course they see it, except they didn't. And once they said that to me, I was like, oh my gosh, you're right. Like, okay, I can approach this totally differently now, because it just never actually occurred to me that they didn't see it. I really, in my mind, this was a willful choice that was being made to
So
not follow up on some stuff.
it's so interesting. I could
Mm.
seriously and do like I could study the brain, the gifted
Oh,
brain in
yeah.
particular, forever. I'm so grateful that I went down this path because it's fascinating the way the mind
Yeah.
works. And like you said in there, brings up what I've said for years and years, and so many people in our genre, I don't know, what do you call it,
Field, in our
field,
field.
that's
Yeah.
the word. See, could not come up with the word, have said if you've met one gifted kid or person, you've met one gifted person, like, because it's
Correct.
so, they're just as discrepant from one another as they are from the general population, if not more so. And
Yeah.
so how, Christine, as parents, do we sift through that when their giftedness is different than our giftedness and different from each of their siblings' giftedness, whether we're homeschooling them or not? How do we set them up for success through these intensities and through these differences when they're so different from their peers out in the world as well as each other in the home?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm immediately brought back to kind of the role of the parent as emotional coach, and the role of parent as really being the primary instructor or educator for EQ. So I often say in trainings that I do with educators or with parents that the amount of potential, your IQ, that you get to use is completely commensurate with the development of your EQ. So if your EQ is not well developed, if you don't have a sense of your emotional processes, you don't have good emotional literacy, you don't have good self-awareness, you don't have the capacity to regulate your emotions and behaviors, if you don't have good interpersonal skills and conflict resolution skills, if you don't have that development of social awareness where you really kind of understand where you begin and end and where another individual begins and ends, and how to walk through the world with another and hold space for them without being judgmental and without expecting them to have experiences like yours, or just being able to be kind of along for the journey. If you're not able to regulate your attention in any kind of capacity, or recognize when your attention isn't regulated and do something about that, those skills enable us to be good humans. The potential we have enables us to capitalize using those skills and capitalize on this whole other stuff of capacity that we have that enables us to innovate and gives us the passion necessary and the drive necessary to be able to create and some of these other really profound, fabulous contributions that we're able to make to life as a whole. But those first sets of abilities, which anybody can learn, that's what determines whether or not we're able to do this in a multi-diverse world with any kind of success and keep our own mental health where we need it as well.
Yes, yes, that's so good. And such a great description of how emotional intelligence fuels the intelligence quotient and how those fit together and why essentially there is research out there that shows definitively that if you have a stronger EQ, you're going to be more successful no matter
100%.
what your IQ is
100%.
because
That's
of
that.
soft.
It kind of, to me, it ends that whole nature, nurture, EQ, IQ, grit, whatever conversation that people want to get into that I just think is a whole lot of minutia. Really, 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 your IQ, how much of it you actually get to use is very dependent on where your EQ is. And I think the role of educator in whether you're homeschooling and so you have teacher hat on, or whether you're in a more traditional educational venue and there's educators who are working with your student, with your child, let them take care of nurturing that IQ part. Let that be the time, if we're homeschooling, that we take care of the IQ part. And the whole rest of the time, let's really not relegate to someone else the responsibility of helping develop EQ. That really needs to be all of ours. And we as parents, we're living with our kids 24/7 if they're in our home, right? And we have these millions of micro moments when we get to build those skills. You have another one of my favorite books that I wrote, The Caring Child, and I talk a lot about utilizing those micro moments. I think it's critical. I think we just have hundreds of them and we let them go to waste when we don't ask that question that is in the back of our head, but we're scared to ask it. So we don't ask it, or we don't go there because we don't feel prepared to have the conversation that's going to likely ensue, especially with our gifted kids, because they're so inquisitive and they're so deep. And as they, get to be the age of your daughter, they will have thoughts and opinions that are different from our own, and that may actually disagree with us. And they may have better logic to it than we do, because we're getting to that threshold point where we're going to be more intellectual equals than, we're fortunate enough when they're younger, we can still outthink them. That changes as they hit the, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 range. We have the benefit of experience. And so we have a different understanding of how the world works. But I would argue, especially now with the current generation, we actually don't. Like they're still at an advantage on us on understanding some of the quantum ways the world actually can work, as opposed to our kind of previous definitions of that. So I don't know.
It's really interesting, this new generation, this current generation, I guess, of teenagers and young adults. The experiences they bring to the table are such that, I work online, so I've got a little bit better of an understanding than some of my peers, but still my kids outstrip me, very, very quickly, even, my younger ones. And that requires a deeper level of that empathy and emotional intelligence, like you talk about in The Caring Child. And so we need to be really tuned into what our kids are saying, what they're doing, what the meanings underneath are, and then be willing to have those difficult conversations, right? Normalizing the talking about feelings and validating their feelings, even if you don't agree with them. It doesn't
exactly.
You don't have the right to tell them how to feel. Now, behavior, like you said earlier, when
that's different.
That's a choice.
Like my youngest is kind of the classic dissociate, right? So she stresses out, she'll hide in a closet, she'll hide under the bed when she was little, she'll dissociate, she'll yes ma'am you to death, and whatever. That's how she functioned. My oldest, she's fight or flight, and she's fight, like hardcore fight, has been since the day she took her first breath onto this planet. It has served her well, except when it doesn't, right? Because sometimes it does, that doesn't, because that can often come out as anger. And I can remember her being younger and her likening herself to the Hulk. I thought it was such a perfect analogy, because she said there would be times that very much like Bruce Banner, who felt so much remorse every time the Hulk came out. He didn't want that either, but he didn't necessarily have control over that. And he didn't know how to integrate it until much later. And so when she would explain kind of her wave of emotions, she would use that analogy, which I just thought was so apropos for her at that time in helping us understand what she was experiencing, the way she was experiencing her very large emotions, which then enabled us to work with her a little differently on it. Because what you don't want to do is shame your kid, right?
Right.
For the way in which they're experiencing emotions. There's not a darn thing wrong with any of the emotions that any human being has. There's actually nothing wrong with how they experience them either. Now, that being said, sometimes that experience is going to help them and sometimes that experience is going to hurt them. And part of what they need to learn is how to discern that and how to adjust.
Mhm.
So rather than talking about something being good or bad, behavior good or bad, and in those terms, that's very binary. It's too binary for me and for human beings in general, I think. It's really, is the way you're showing up right now in space, is that working for you? Are you getting the response from your environment that you were hoping to get by showing up that way? If the answer is not yes, then it's on you to adjust it because the outside world can't adjust your behavior for you. They can impose restrictions on your life that aren't particularly fun as a way to persuade you to change your behavior, but ultimately it's still your choice.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a very pragmatic human. This is what I used to always tell my kids. I'm very pragmatic. I would much prefer an easy way to a hard way if an easy way exists. So, yeah, how about we don't put ourselves in positions where the world needs to impose a restriction on you because of choices you're making? And that's literally how I talk to my kids from the time they were born.
It's great. And I think that brings up a really good point too, because that's how we need to talk to gifted individuals because they are processing the world in a different way and they're processing it at a much quicker and higher rate of understanding than a neurotypical child into adulthood. And so we need to talk to them in ways they're going to be able to use it pragmatically and apply it throughout their lifetime. And so we can't use the kind of coddling language we would normally use with a child of whatever age. I mean, when I talk to my 11-year-old, I'm not talking to him like most of my friends are talking to their 11-year-olds because it would not work in the same way. Just like when my oldest was young, my oldest sounds so much like your oldest. And it just cracked me up when you said the fight or flight and she's going to choose flight or fight. That
every
was
time,
my son
100% of the time,
like 100% of the time, probably even more if he could have gotten away with it. And he used to describe not like he was the Hulk, but I love that gifted kids have this metacognitive ability to describe what they're thinking and feeling in ways that can help you
their own language.
Yes.
When my oldest was diagnosed with her anxiety disorder and she was really trying to figure it out, she was at the very beginning stages of trying to figure that out. She is my math nerd also. So she's my artist, but she's my math nerd too. Okay. She made it a mathematical formula and tried to figure out what the variables were that would help her know if it was going to be a really anxious day or not an anxious day based on a set of variables.
It's so interesting. My oldest used to describe how he couldn't shut down his mind and why he was so impulsive. Like he said, I picture my brain like a wind up toy and the key just got wound too tight, but then got stuck. So it won't get off of that gear. And I can't figure out how to get it off the gear.
The tension's too high.
Yeah.
So he has to learn how to regulate the tension. See, what's so great about that, because of my daughter being who she was, it really opened up, and because of my own giftedness, it opened up my capacity in working with even neurotypical kids to talk about, let's put this in a language that makes sense to you. How would you describe this? And so even with neurotypical kids, there's strategies that I used to only utilize with my gifted kiddos that I can kind of translate a little bit and utilize with my neurotypical kiddos successfully as well.
That's what I've always said about, just teaching gifted and having my master's in gifted studies or education or whatever the degree is. Yeah, that what I do is good for all kids. It's crucial for gifted kids.
Right. That's exactly how I describe the books and stuff too. Yeah, totally.
So, you can glean so much from the way that we interact with gifted individuals that will make you a better parent, a better teacher, a better adult, a better facilitator of the world. But for those individuals you come across who are gifted, it is crucial and imperative that you interact with them in
You
these
don't
ways.
have the luxury of this. Yeah, you can you don't have the luxury of coddling language. Like you just don't have that luxury. Not if you really want them to kind of not be some of the downside that we read about sometimes of things that happen with our gifted individuals when the world became too hard, too loud, too fast, too much.
Right. Right. Yeah. We're setting them up for success so we can have those conversations when the conversations are crucial.
Right.
And, by doing that, when they're just every day helping them fit in and
Right.
not fit in, but be the best version of themselves in the situation that they're in. So, we don't want our kids to dumb themselves down or forget about who they are, but we want them to appreciate the other perspectives that people come into the table with.
Right. And value that as, again, it's that social awareness piece,
Yeah.
right? Like, this is who I am. This is who you are. Both are okay.
Yeah.
My reality has actually nothing to do with your reality. And I don't have a right to belittle your reality because it doesn't match my reality.
Exactly. Exactly. Oh my gosh, you are absolutely right. We could kind of go on to like 4 or 5 different podcast
And
episodes and in, di- in different areas.
yeah,
We should have gotten together to just chat a long time before
a
this.
long time ago. I know.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so we do have to wrap up because people will start to glaze over after a while. And we don't want that. I want to encourage before we wrap up, get those 2 books. If you've not read Emotional Intensity and Gifted Students, there's a 3rd edition out right now, and it is new and improved, and it is everything I've always loved about the previous editions, but more and more applicable to today. So get that and get The Caring Child. The emotional intelligence pieces in there, the empathy, the ways to interact with your kids and help them be more empathetic. Those soft skills are so important. And just from the experience of having a young adult child and a teen child who are entering the job market, they're lacking. We want our kids to have that. My son was told by an interviewer at like a fast food place that he's the first one in all of this particular interview process from this interviewer that had not pulled out his phone or had consistently made eye contact during the thing. And he came home to me and said, I thought that was actually the bare minimum. Like, I didn't think I was doing
Right.
anything
I didn't think that'd
special.
be special.
Right.
Right.
And so
Totally.
we really want our kids to be able to harness those EQ skills to be the best versions of themselves. And these books are going to help you there and dive into Christine's world. But Christine, before we go, is there anything like one last piece of advice, information, a tidbit, a thought that you had that we didn't get to maybe that you think would help parents of gifted kids who are with them 24/7 from the education hat and the parenting hat, just survive another day or help their kids get to where they need them to go?
Your kid will be fine. You have to trust me on this. They really, really will be fine, despite all evidence to the contrary today. So trust that that is true. 2, odds are exceptionally good that you're gifted or real close, if not textbook definition. So use everything you're learning about your kid as an opportunity to self-reflect. And if you find yourself super, super triggered by something going on with your kid, look first inside because there might be a little wounding there it's just tapping in on. And the more we get cleaned up as humans, the easier it is for us then to successfully help our kids do the same.
Oh, that's so good. So good and so true. How many of us as adults are learning about ourselves so deeply as we're learning about how to help our kids and how to be the best parents for
And
them?
some systemic wounding that may have happened because things were different in our generation, maybe with the identification process or with us understanding who we were or whatever the case may be. There might be some wounding there. So
Right. Yeah, like you said about the one paragraph in your psychology work about
mhm.
giftedness, it was the same in my education degree.
Yep.
My bachelor's degree is in elementary education, and there was one paragraph in one textbook in one class that
Yeah,
mentioned
exactly.
giftedness, and it was completely glossed. I mean, and it was a short paragraph. We're talking like 3 or 4 sentences.
Yeah,
And
100%.
so I didn't know what I didn't know until I got into my master's work and started working under Jim. And then it just unlocked so much about myself, and then about, set me up to be able to support my children in a great way. And like we talked about earlier, the neurotypical children that I was also working with at the time. Yeah. So good. So good. Where can people find you and get more information about your books and about you?
So my books are all on Amazon. It's probably the easiest place to get them is on Amazon, and it ChristineFonseca.com. The website seriously needs to be redone. That is a summer project. But you can find me there as well. And I've got some new ideas for books. I do have a Facebook group called the Intense Life Tribe. You're welcome to join me there. And if you just find me in any one of those venues and message me, I can lead you to anything else.
I love that. We'll make sure that we link to all of those places, including the Facebook group, in the show notes for this episode. And I'm so grateful that you took the time to visit with me, and we'll have to get you back on and go down one of those other rabbit trails.
Absolutely. I have a feeling, like you just said, you and I could go down a lot of rabbit holes together. So I think it'd be fun.
It would be. Thank you. Especially we're recording this on a holiday weekend, so this is great.
It's all good. It's all good.
So I appreciate it. All right. So those of you listening, thank you for spending time here. I know you've got a lot of places that you can spend your time, so I'm grateful for you and for your support. You can find links to all the resources that we talked about. You can find links to get in touch with Christine and get in her world on the show notes for this episode at RaisingLifelongLearners.com. And we'll be back same time, same place next week with another episode. In the meantime, go enjoy your kids. Lean into those quirks, have fun, go on some adventures together, and just enjoy being able to have the opportunities that you do to spend those micro moments with them and spend time. I'm so grateful for you. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.